Alright, so we're going to start out with our pattern. I cut this out of an old folder that I had. It's just your basic North style neckline. It's got a keyhole. And then we've got the clear ruler. You can also use a seam gauge if you would prefer that, or if that's what you have. And then I've just got a basic pin. You can also use chalk if you'd prefer. And then our piece of fabric. If you want to use chalk, that's fine. This is all going to be on the inside, so it doesn't matter too much what you use to mark it with. Now you're going to lay your pattern on your fabric. You want to try to make sure you've got about a 1/2 inch allowance around the edges. I'm a little bit short on this piece, but that'll be okay. Then we're going to trace around. I like to start with the inside. Make sure you get your keyhole. And then you're going to just trace around the outside edge. You can do this as bold or as light as you would like. You just want to make sure that you can see that edge and that line really clearly, especially if you're using a clear ruler. You want to be able to make sure that you can see that line through your clear ruler. Now that we've got that all traced, I'll try to show you here on the camera. It's kind of hard to see. I traced it pretty light, but it's dark enough for me to see through my ruler, so it'll be all right. Got all the important bits of the pattern there. Got the keyhole line, that'll come into play later. And now we're going to take the clear ruler and we're just going to trace a 1/2 inch outside of the original pattern line for our seam allowance. So now you can see the double line here. That's going to be our seam allowance. Now we're ready to cut. Now that it's all cut out, we're ready to iron it. I like to serge my edges, but that's personal preference. If you don't have a serger, if you don't want to, you absolutely don't have to do that. You're gonna line your pattern back up on the original pattern lines. Make sure it's nice and straight, those lines line up nicely. And then you're gonna use the edge of the pattern as a firm edge to iron against. This is why you wanna cut your pattern out of poster board or a folder or something that's going to withstand some pressure and some heat. You want to make sure your corners fold over so they're nice and crisp. And just iron those edges down nice and neat. Once again, fold your edges over nice and neat so you get a nice crisp corner. Iron them down. And then you're going to want to start working your way around the round part of the neckline. You might end up with some wiggly bits or some creases on the inside, and that's fine. You mostly just want to make sure that the outside of the fabric is nice and smooth and that there's no creases or lines, puckers on the outside of the fabric, because that's what's going to show. Now you can flip the whole thing over, make sure everything is nice and smooth from the outside. If you've got any weird puckers or anything, you can work those out with the iron. You may have noticed that we haven't cut the neck hole yet. This is extremely important. You do not want to cut the neck hole until the very end, and I'll show you that as well. Make sure everything's nice and smooth. Nice round smooth edges. all the stuff that's going to show. Now we're ready to pin our neckline to the body piece of our fabric. We want to line up that center point with the center of our body, and we want to line up the side edges just off center. You want about 3/4 to the front and 1/4 to the back. Pin along that inside line that you marked with the pattern. We're ready to sew. I like to stitch just on the outside of my line so that I've got enough space for any bulk that accumulates to have a properly fitted neckline. Once you reach the bottom of your keyhole, you're going to turn your fabric, and I usually stitch about 2 or 3 stitches across the bottom depending on your stitch width, and then I backspace and go forward again. This does give you a little bit wider of a keyhole neckline, but I found that it helps everything lay a lot flatter and a lot nicer once you get it all laid out and stitched down. Here you can see how I stitched just barely outside of that pattern line all the way around. You're going to use that pattern line as a cutting line when you cut the neck hole out.
Now we're ready to cut out our neck hole. I start in the center and make a snip, just enough to get my scissors inside. I like to use pinking shears. I cut down to the keyhole and very carefully cut between my stitching lines. You want to be sure that you don't accidentally snip any of your stitching lines. If so, you need to go back and restitch it immediately. You're going to cut almost all the way down to the very tip. And once you get to the tip, you're going to cut a V shape into it, coming from the pinking line to each corner. Very hard to see on camera, but it's extremely important to make sure everything lays flat. Now you'll go back and use that pattern line to cut the rest of the neck hole out. Now that it's cut, we're going to flip this to the right side of the fabric. You want to make sure that you get your corners nice and folded out so that they're nice and clean and crisp. And we'll go back through and we'll turn those again with a point turner to make sure they're nice and pointy. You can see how it's kind of wobbly, kind of wrinkly right now. And this is where your iron is going to come in very, very handy on this next step. So now we're going to iron it. We're going to hit those seam allowances once again to make sure they're still nice and crisp. And we're going to hit any of these points that are very wrinkly, and we're going to work those wrinkles out. You're going to want to take your time on this. Sometimes it takes a while to get the wrinkles nice and worked out. And you want to make sure that you get nice crisp edges on the inside of the neckline and on the outside of the neckline. You really want to make sure everything is laying nice and flat before you stitch anything down. Now we're going to pin down that outside edge of our neckline so that we can stitch it down nice and smooth. Now we're going to stitch down this outside edge, and as you can see, I decided kind of last second to add a little bit of extra fancy to this particular tunic. I added some rope edging that I'm just going to stitch down with it. Nothing really changes. If you want to add something like this, you just pin it in along with the neckline and the body. You're just going to stitch on the very outside edge all the way around, making sure that you keep everything nice and tight and together. You don't want any wrinkles as you sew. So here we have our finished neckline. As you can see, everything is very, very smooth. There's very minimal puckering at the bottom of the keyhole. And all the edges are really smooth and nice. Everything's laying really nicely, and you're ready to finish the rest of your tunic. This should be the very first step that you take anytime you make a dress or a tunic. You want to put your neckline in very first. You can do contrasting necklines like this. You can do invisible facings where you would do this just on the inside. It's really up to you. Thanks for watching, guys.